Okay. Where's my mouse? Well, I have a Google Hangouts. There's sharing my screen notification that I can't hide. So it's a cool way to start. Hi, I'm Winston. I am a front-end engineer. I do JavaScript, HTML, CSS, actually mostly Sass these days. I work for Vox Media, so we produce, like, if you've ever seen Vox.com or The Verge, or my favorite is Racked, our fashion site, and a bunch of other sites. The company's based out of DC and New York. I work here remotely. I just moved here in October. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Such Winston. I don't recommend following me because I'm pretty annoying. So, so today, I wanted to make one point. So a lot of times, if you start, hopefully after this talk, the goal is you will be interested in accessibility. You will learn some of the basics, but mostly you will be like, I need to do better at this because that's the number one thing we should all be doing is do better at this. So you're going to see ally a lot. It's going to come up. And I learned like 2 weeks ago, accessibility has 11 letters between the A and the Y. And that's why you see ally. It's 11 letters. They're hidden, so that it's shorter. So anyways, that's your first tip on accessibility when you're Googling around and looking for ally. That's why it's ally. It also just, kind of works well in that we want to be, as developers, allies to the people who are having trouble. Or that's a terrible way to put it. The people who do not have all the faculties to browse the web and to use websites that we might have. That's who we want to be allies to. Okay, so the other thing, clearly, is that I'm a beginner at this. I'm still learning every time I'm making websites. I'm doing my work day to day. I'm constantly Googling. I'm constantly, you have to do research. You have to figure out, there's a lot of information. The main thing that we should be doing is being aware and recognizing that we're still beginners. We don't have to fully understand it. We just should factor it in. So I wanted to set that up front and not make you all think that I am coming at this like you are all doing it wrong and I'm doing it right. More just, I think this is important and I think we should all be working better on it. So our goal in accessibility is that we can't make assumptions about how people are browsing the web. We can't make assumptions about that just because we're approaching a website and we can click around and do things the way that we're used to, that's how someone else is doing it. So accessibility is the idea of, I'm not going to make those assumptions. I'm going to take advantage of the tools that other people have given me in HTML and JavaScript and CSS, and I'm going to use those to the full ability so that other people who approach the website using an accessibility device, using an assistive device, or just possibly someone with color blindness, and they don't even need an assistive device, but maybe they don't have the same eyesight you do. Their experience on your website is not hindered. So that's our goal. This is our baseline goals. We want to not get in the way of our users. On that note, this is something, I don't know if you're like me. I've been doing this for like 4 or 5 years now, web development. I did video production before that. I got into web development. And I wasn't necessarily taught accessibility. I was taught HTML. I was taught jQuery, which I then learned was part of JavaScript. And I learned JavaScript. And I kind of worked my way around. But accessibility was something I kind of came to late in the game. It wasn't like people would give you some best tips. They'd say, oh, remember to do this, like an alt tag on an image. But they didn't give me a concept for understanding how accessibility factors into building websites and what we should, how we should judge that and when we should judge whether sites are ready to go or not. So from my perspective, my personal goal is that accessibility concerns are a primary criteria for whether or not a website is production ready. So it's not something we do in version 2. It's not something that we'll get to later. We don't ship until we've made sure that the baseline of accessibility is covered. I think that's, to me, like once you get into this world and start learning, and I'm going to go into a bunch of like baseline best practices in a minute, they're not that hard. It just sometimes means that we have to take an extra step of remembering them and factoring that in when we're architecting things. So the other cool thing in this whole process of learning accessibility, trying to make our websites better, trying to make the web more friendly to every person who wants to access it, is that HTML is accessible by design. There's tons of smart people building out specs. They're thinking through these things. It's not on you to reinvent the wheel every time. It's up to you to just do the work of researching and understanding how things are best designed so that you can make your websites better. In that sense, it's our ignorance and our carelessness that causes many problems for the people who are coming to our sites with assistive devices or with other disabilities. Okay, so the baseline, I'm going to have this link up at the end, but WebAIM is a really great resource if you're wanting to just like right now know where you should go to find out more information, and you learn better by reading, which is how I learned better. That's where you start, webaim.org. On that site, you'll find that somewhere up to 20% of people in the US have disabilities. Now, not all of these disabilities necessarily affect web browsing. A soldier who's come back from war and has lost an arm, they counted in the disability group, but they may be able to browse the web just like you and I do and have no hindrance there. But that's kind of a baseline starting point of like, wow, up to a fifth of people in the US may be approaching the web in a different way than I personally am, or may have vastly different experiences when they're browsing, just trying to read the news, or trying to get on Facebook, or trying to get information about your restaurant, or whatever. That I have to factor that in. So, a survey, or like some types, I mentioned color blindness. Color blindness affects a large portion of the population. There's people who, one thing that I've found is interesting is people who may have motor skill issues where like they have shakes, or they are having trouble, they can't just like swipe, and they can't just move a mouse like you and I do because their muscles don't work in exactly the same way. So there are plenty of awesome devices that help them completely ignore this this issue that they have and still work fine, but it does mean that maybe they approach swiping and they approach mobile differently than you and I do. Another cool thing, Aaron Gustafsson, who has spoken here before, he just was talking online. He got a new smartphone that's completely touchless. So it's a Nexus Google phone that uses facial tracking and eye tracking to where you can hopefully, I haven't gotten to play with it yet, but hopefully have normal usability on a smartphone just by using your eyes and your face, which is really cool. But I think of that and I'm like, oh, that would change the way that I would build certain things if I realized certain users aren't going to like have that curiosity. They aren't going to be able to swipe around the way that we may want to when we hide things and want them to be discoverable as is common on the web. So we got to learn to factor these in. And the last point, just in kind of the baseline of why accessibility is important, is a lot of time users with disabilities are not going to be in your analytics at all. The devices that they use are all client side. A lot of people who use screen readers, there's nothing about that screen reader that's going to communicate to your analytics that says this user has a screen reader. All that screen reader is doing is accessing the HTML and JavaScript that you provide and then dictating it to the user so that they can browse your website. But you will never know that they were there. And if they leave quickly, you'll never know as well. So a lot of times, if we have a bad experience, people are going to try to hit our sites, they're going to find that it's unusable, they're going to leave, we'll never know. So I think a lot of times we kind of measure, if we're in a product world or an agency world, we measure like how much time we can spend on something based on who our users are and who our audience and demographics are. And the hard thing about disability, and the reason accessibility is so important, is we have no idea. We have no idea. We can't make assumptions about who's coming to our site and say, oh, well, we know that they're not going to use it this way, because we don't know. We have no analytics on this. So that's my whole spiel of why I think accessibility is really important and how we should think about it. So now let's, I'm just going to spend the rest of my time, and feel free to pipe up with questions, feel free to pipe up with thoughts. These are like the baseline, when you're building a website, things that will help improve usability and accessibility. There's so much more you can do, there's so much more you can learn about, and there's so many people online who share their experiences that we can Google around and learn. But here's the starting point. Okay, so the first thing, I know this doesn't count as standard accessibility, but I think going back to that original goal that I set of we don't want to get in the way of users, when we start thinking about websites and the web and the internet as something used by humans on the other side of the internet, through the series of pipes and come out on their screen and there's a person over there, that's when we start building in accessibility. That's when we start architecting, hopefully in smarter ways. And one of the things that really affects that is the language that we use. And this is not, this is a hard one in that it starts to sound politically correct and maybe you have opinions about that. But the point is, when you're building, when you're writing copy, when you're working on websites, you don't know who your users are, and so you want to be careful and understand as much as you can the different ways that you frame things. This came up this morning. A coworker of mine is transgender, and she posted in Slack something that was going around. Someone had filled out a little population form, or sorry, a demographics form. It was like, fill out this form to give us your demographics, sign up for the site. And under gender, the pop down, it had male, female, male to female, female to male, gender queer, and a couple others. The people were trying, but they were way off. Like, those are not genders. That's not, like, they were trying and failing. It was worse that they tried than if they had not tried at that point. And so we just got to be empathetic. And this covers so many different things of like how you center yourself and how you present yourself. But words matter. And I don't know, it's a thing that I care about, so I wanted to mention that. Okay, the next thing that you should do, this is something that I failed at for a long time. I just did it on my site the other day and realized that some of my text is off, is you should check color contrast. So there's actual specifications published by the W3 working group of like, if your text is this small on the web, the ratio of the background color to the text color should be this high. And then it changes if your text gets bigger, and it changes. And so you, first of all, you have numbers you can work against. Second of all, there are tools available that will just quickly scan your page and tell you, nope, you're off. The designers at Vox have recently been playing around with their Photoshop plugins that like eyedropper here, an eyedropper here to select two colors, and it'll tell you your color contrast ratio and whether or not you can do this. So this is something that if you're designing websites, it's not something you necessarily think about, because a lot of times we think of color contrast as like dark versus light. But the thing about color blindness is it kind of can invert that. You can have two colors that if you have full color range, they appear to be really contrast, but certain types of color blindness will wipe out color in such a way that they look identical, even though to us they appear very contrasty. And so these tools are very helpful in helping us establish what will be usable by people who visit our sites. I think the rest of everything I have to talk about is HTML specific, so let's get started. The first thing, this is new with HTML5 in the past couple of years. It used to be we would do things like A, and then the href would be a pound symbol, which doesn't go anywhere. And you would add a click listener, JavaScript, click, this is jQuery, but click, and then prevent the default. Don't do anything when you click, because I'm going to run some JavaScript. Or we would say the href is JavaScript, and that was just kind of a semantic way of saying, hey, JavaScript will run when this is clicked. And we would do the same. We would prevent default and then run whatever we want to do. Pop up in a modal, whatever it is. This is a bad practice now. If you're doing this, if you're doing A tags, you should stop and you should change them to buttons. Now that with HTML5 there's a button element, and you strangely have to say type equals button, which, okay, you can also do type equals submit. There's a bunch of different ones. But this semantically says, hey, this is just a button, and it's not going to try to redirect the browser. Something else is going to happen when that button is clicked. And then you can run your JavaScript based on that button element. And things will work better, and screen readers will handle it much nicer. So that's a cool one. The alt tag that I mentioned earlier on images is still important. Screen readers specifically and keyboard users will have that read out loud to them. So whatever your alt tag is, will be what they see when they come to the image. Now, a lot of times we're working in dynamic web apps now. Like I work on a big Rails app, and so it's not like I hand code each image. And so what you need to do is when you're building out however the images are put into your site, whatever helpers you're using, make sure that you factor in an alt tag should be on every image. The exceptions to this are if you're using icons. You might look into, you can Google around, there's different ways that you can mark up icons, there's different ways that you can make things more helpful to keyboard users. There's tons of information on this if you Google, so I'm just kind of like touching high level over the baseline, I guess you could say. But anyways, alt tags are still important, and every image should have one. Labels. I don't know, I think, is Aaron's talk archived somewhere?
It's the first one that we
archived.
The audio quality is a little...
Okay. Aaron Gustafsson is a developer here in town. He works for Microsoft, and he did a talk like late last year about forms, and it goes into much more detail than here, and he actually has like snippets from screen readers so you can kind of hear what it sounds like as you change these things. But basically, the main thing you want to do is you want to use this for attribute and the ID attribute on every label and input, because this label will get read, but if this is not here, it's not going to be associated. The two will not be linked, and a screen reader user will not have any idea. They will hear the label, but they will not know where they then add their input if there's an input. And you can do with checkboxes, there's a way to link them kind of by putting the checkbox in the label, and there's different things you can do. You should definitely, if you're building forms, do your research, because forms are very messy when it comes to the ways we hack them to make them all cool, and the ways that they're best architected to help screen reader users and other users who may not be necessarily scanning the page. Placeholders is another one. A lot of times it's a common pattern to do now to not even have the label. You do input and then you add a placeholder equals and you put the placeholder inside. And this is not necessarily the best practice. You can do labels that are hidden. They're visually hidden, so you're not going to see them, but they will still be read to screen readers. And that's another thing that you can do, because it's very, you should look into usability research on placeholders anyways, because it's questionable whether they're the best idea. But if you're using that pattern of having just a form input with a placeholder inside of it and no other label, make sure you still add an HTML label for those users. Okay, this is one that I recently learned about, and I think a lot of us probably use like Bootstrap or Foundation or other like HTML reset, CSS resets, I think is another one, like normalize.css. And it used to be that all of them removed the focus outline. So if you've ever like just written straight HTML and not loaded in any CSS and tabbed through a link or a form, you'll see a blue outline. And on Chrome and Safari and Firefox, it looks different and it's ugly. And so we all want to remove it. We want to reset it and make everything kind of clean, and then we'll build it back. But a lot of times we never add back those focus highlights. And this is very much an anti-pattern. Keyboard users tab through. That's their only way. They may not have access to a mouse. They may not. They may be using something else that tabs through for them. That outline is the only way that they can know what is currently selected. So if you find this in your CSS, add it back. You can play around with it. You can make it pleasant. You can style it according to your brand. The important thing is let users know where they are on the page as they're tabbing through. You can open up your site right now, hit tab key, and if you don't see what is active, this is a problem in your site. Okay, this is a cool other HTML5 thing recently, and I learned about. So last year I was working for a company called Editorially, which was a writing platform online, and it shut down. But right before it shut down and ran out of money, a user who used screen readers reached out to us to say that they loved our product, and they were so excited that it was so easy for them to use. And so one of our developers responded and said, hey, can I talk to you? We want to know more how to make this better. We're so glad that you can do it. And so he went and talked to her for a while. And one of the things that she recommended was that we take advantage of these roles, which we were not taking advantage of at the time. Okay, so a role is like basically you're saying this section is this thing in my HTML. So you think about a typical website, you might have a header up top and then some navigation and then your main content, and maybe you're going to have like a sidebar, and you're going to have these elements that we commonly find. So they've been kind of codified in the spec. You can either do, if you just have a standard div tag, you can do this attribute. You can add an attribute which says role equals banner or main being the main content of the page. This is what you're looking for if you want to find all the meat of the page. Navigation for navigation, content info for descriptive text about what you'll find on there, and complementary is just like a sidebar. You can just add these to a normal div or span or any tag, and screen readers can then jump, right? So if you think about when you hit a web page, you will load it up, and you don't have to read through every single item on the nav before you get down to the paragraph of text that you're interested to. But that's often how screen readers work. They start at the top, and they just go down the page, and so everything will be read out loud to them, unless you're taking advantage of these roles, in which case it allows the user basically to jump sections, which is much more in line with how we use. HTML5 introduces these special tags. You have to create them if you support IE8, but there's little polyfills that will do that. But basically, it's a header tag and a main tag and a nav and a footer and an aside. And if you're using these tags, you don't have to mark the roles up. I recommend going and reading up on the spec for this. It's short. There's rules about each role should only be once on the page. Kind of like how the flow should go. But they're really cool, and screen reader users love you if you use them, we discover. So this is another anti-pattern, specifically for mobile. I think it's kind of gone out of fashion now. I find that now I can actually zoom in on pages. A lot of times, you know, with responsive web design, the site will load and it will be the right side of your phone, but maybe some text is small or an image is small, and so you'll go to zoom in with your fingers. Maybe you've hit those sites where you can't, and you're like trying to zoom with your finger and nothing is getting bigger, and you're like, okay, fine, I won't. Those people are using this meta tag, which is maximum scale equals 1, saying a user cannot zoom. This is terrible for people with visual impairments because they may hit a page and immediately zoom up to read your text. Like it may be a fine and usable size of text for someone with glasses or fairly normal vision, but someone who is legally blind but can still see may need to zoom up a little bit. And so you don't want to disable zooming whatever you do. And there's other things you can research about the different CSS text sizing properties, ems, pixels, all of those. Those operate differently when you're zooming and you're on a desktop and you hit like Command plus or Control plus. So do a little research. There's plenty of articles that just kind of give you a basic overview, and that's interesting to learn about. I always think about this because my granddad, who died a couple years ago, the last couple years he was alive, he was going deaf, he was going blind, but mentally he still had all his faculties. He still loved to read. He loved to watch Fox News and he loved to read. But he was going blind, and so every day he would try to read, and it just got harder and harder. Large print books weren't big enough. And so two things were amazing for this. One, we got him an iPad, and Instapaper had no like stop at how big you can make the text. You could just sit there and crank it up, and there would be like one sentence on the whole iPad, and it would be like the words were this big, but he could read it, and it was great. He loved it. He would sit there and read his Kindle books, or read newspaper articles they would send to Instapaper. The Kindle app let it go slightly big, but it had a stop. The other thing that he ended up doing was he was a vet, and the Army gave him like a text magnifier, like a microfiche thing, except for books, and he would sit there and read it. But I think about things like that when we decide for aesthetic reasons to disable scaling. We're hindering certain people, and we don't know who those people are. Okay, the last thing, I feel like I'm blazing through this. I'm sorry, I get nervous and talk really fast. But the last thing that is really cool in the past couple of years, if you're working in the web right now, you probably are working in big dynamic web applications. JavaScript, you're maybe writing an Ember app or an Angular or React or your own Backbone custom, whatever it is you're working in, you're doing a lot of DOM manipulation, you're trying to keep refreshes on the down, you're trying to just make the web interactive and cool without kind of the web 1.0 version of things. Those are really cool, but they can present a lot of issues to screen reader users, to keyboard users, because the DOM is constantly being refreshed and repainted. And so what you can look into is this. I don't remember what WAI stands for, but ARRIA is Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it's this whole spec that the W3 has come up with that browsers are starting to support, where you can basically mark up things and say, like, this is an interactive element, or this, like, you can just tack on little attributes that are only for screen readers and other assistive devices that basically allow you to do all the cool things you're doing and still communicate that to screen readers. So this is the spec, w3.org, ARRIA. Yeah, that's the spec. That's the info. There's a whole info page on GitHub. If you just Google ARRIA, you'll find a lot of things. But let me show you a couple things that it can do. So there's a few rules you should know about ARRIA, which is it's meant to fill in the gaps. If you're doing really cool things with JavaScript and really dynamic things, and you can express it in HTML5 first, do that. If you can build form elements that are native form elements, if you can use the roles, if you can alert users like to form invalidation through native means, take advantage of that. ARRIA is meant to be the spec doesn't cover it, so I'm going to use ARRIA. Second of all, don't change native semantics. So like if you have a span element that you want to be clickable, and you try to use the ARRIA spec to say this is an interactive element, don't do that. You could use a button. And it's much better to use a button or default to whatever native element should work. Like don't try to change elements to be what you want them to be. The third rule, I guess, is read up, which is, I can't tell you everything. But here's a couple cool things. So there's ARRIA Controls. A lot of times we'll have elements where it's like, if you click this button, it's going to reveal a tab, maybe like bootstrap tabs, if you think of that, where there's like 3 buttons up top, but the content area only 1 is. So those tabs can be, you can say, hey, this button controls this section down here by ID. And when a user clicks that, that section will change, and the screen reader now knows to look there for the changes. You can use ARRIA Hidden. A lot of times we use display none. A lot of times we don't. We hide things through other means, or we take them out. And ARRIA Hidden enables us to accessible or semantically say, hey, this element is not visible right now. You got to be careful with ARRIA Hidden, though, because what ARRIA Hidden tells the screen reader is nothing inside this element should be read. It's invisible. So if you have ARRIA Hidden, but you're trying to actually communicate to the user, it's not going to happen. And then last of all is ARRIA Expanded. If you've ever had elements where on a page, you know, you're trying to save space, you're trying to only reveal information as it's needed on demand, ARRIA Expanded is a way of semantically saying, hey, this element is not expanded right now. Or if a user clicks and toggles something, you can say, yeah, it's expanded equals true. And the screen reader will now know that that's available. So basically the ARRIA spec is, I find it really fascinating. There's lots of information as people are learning how to use it and apply it in ways that we no longer have to let screen readers don't have to hold us back from doing things because we want to communicate and make the web friendly to all users. Instead, we can find ways to incorporate communication to them alongside whatever cutting edge or new cool tool we're using. That's my talk. There's plenty of other information out there. There's so much information. There's so much I didn't cover, but hopefully this is a good start. Hopefully it piques your curiosity and kind of gives you an idea of maybe some things that you could go fix on your site. But I'd love to take questions. I have no clue what time it is.
We're good, yeah.
yeah, that's the best site to start, but just Google around.
This is above and beyond section 508.
This is section, okay, so the question is this is above and beyond section 508. I think most everything in here except for maybe ARRIA spec is basics of section 508. For those who don't know, section 508 is the federal requirements. Federal sites have to be accessible, and 508 is what defines what that is. And 508 is kind of outdated. It's kind of older. So some of the newer stuff like HTML5 augments that, but it's not necessarily covered in that. But as far as if you're wondering what should be a definition of an accessible site, 508 is a baseline. It's outdated. There's lots more you can do, but it'll give you a kind of an idea of what the law sees as a baseline for accessible users. Other questions? Yo.
I was wondering if you could, do you know how to fire up the screen reader on a Mac?
You can fire up VoiceOver,
Okay.
but I haven't done a demo recently to where I feel comfortable walking you through. But VoiceOver is supposedly the worst of all the screen readers, but it works. If you wanted to just get an idea, I can show you this. So in the accessibility pane, if you have a Mac, if you're working on Mac, you can enable VoiceOver. And
on the screen and can be used to control.
oh, that's gonna screw with our Hangout.
Chrome Box is really good. It's
Yeah.
just the Chrome Web Store.
Yes, Chromevox, and then Firefox has a couple things. There's tons of plugins. I just installed one yesterday for Firefox that will rank your whole site on all sorts of accessibility best practices. It's like an enterprise level thing. I pulled it up on like a Verge article or something, and it was like 208 issues. I was like, ow. I mean, I don't specifically own those issues, but still, it kind of goes to show that like every page is going to hurt when you first pull that up, because there's plenty to be thinking about.
Yeah, my friend, like I wasn't getting the screen reader thing. I couldn't find the right empathy.
Yeah.
And then my friend actually had me go through a page.
Yeah.
With a screen reader, and like totally, yeah, it blew my mind. So
Right. It's awful.
It's like worth doing as an exercise to really understand, like, real people really use this, and it's
Right.
how they view the web.
Because a lot of times your site will have some flaw that basically you hit a roadblock, and a user who's using VoiceOver can't move forward. Like they've literally come to the end of the sidewalk, and your site is like, sorry. So that's enlightening and harmful in a personal pride sort of way. Other questions? Cool. Well, thanks. I'm such Winston Hearn. I'm going to try to write all this up, but it'll probably be next week because I have 2 kids and I don't ever have time to do things like that. But I'm going to try to put all this on the site. WebAIM is a great resource. There's so much out there that you can Google around and find. And last of all, just because I like where I work, Vox is hiring in case you're looking for a job. So let me know. Thanks.